As Alana said, I am Mikayla Laird, if you want to use the full name. I have been a student since 2013, which is really scary now that I think about it. I did my undergraduate and my master's degree here in digital media, and now I'm a VL on digital media and animation. I started my PhD at the beginning of this year, and it had to be in comics. Somehow I did turn my passion for comics into sort of a fledgling career. I gave my first conference talk last year in Germany, where I discussed the reader's connection to Batman as a form of trauma therapy. As Alana said, I've written twice for the Eisner award-winning magazine Panel X Panel. When lockdown started, I actually banded together with a number of friends and fellow comic book fans from both the UK and America to host a 10-hour live stream discussing comics that we called At Home Comic Con, and we managed to raise $7,000 for charity. Finally, I became a steering group member for the Superhero Project last year, which is something I am immensely proud of. Somehow, I even got to talk to creators I really admire because they had seen my research. When the writer of Batman and Mr. Miracle calls you a dork, I think you're definitely doing something right, at least. Luckily, in my quest to take my research further and prove I didn't waste my time buying comics, I am supported by an amazing team of supervisors, including Dr. Daniel Goodbury, who was also the first person to deliver a lecture when I was a student at UH, Dr. Stephen Adams, who has kept pushing me further and further every time I came to him with a research concern, and Dr. Alana Jelinek, who is above all not afraid to tell me when I'm being dumb or worrying too much. And of course, the most important member of the team, Jones, the cosmic cat of comics, who has made it her mission to sit in on every supervision tutorial and take up the majority of the desk while I'm studying. But what is it I'm actually studying that Jones tries so desperately to interrupt? Something that really fascinates me about comics is that they're able to communicate ideas, especially in relation to time, that no other medium is capable of achieving, especially when it comes to the reader's involvement. It means that when a story actively plays around with the idea of time, I'm very likely to pick it up and read it. Being a DC fan, I don't exactly have a lack of choice. Largely, when discussing the use of time within comics, existing theories work to discuss comics as an entire media, how we perceive moment-to-moment perception. However, little research is done on comics that specifically play with the concept of time as they appear in comics, outside of minor papers on specific short stories and series, such as papers discussing the works of Alan Moore and his stories Watchmen and Promethea. However, what I feel is missing from these studies, and indeed academic study in general, is a look into comics that specifically discuss the idea of time and use the medium of comics to its advantage in ways that no other medium can. So, where is comics studies at the moment? Where are we starting from? So, in 1985, comics practitioner Will Eisner released the book Comics and Sequential Art, based on his own work and many workshops he'd given to young artists and writers. Eisner was already famous in the field for creating such characters as the Spirit in 1940, and releasing the first graphic novel, A Contract with God, in 1978, a graphic novel being a fully finished comic released as a book, without being printed in single issues. Comics and sequential art largely acts as a how-to guide on making comics rather than a full academic discussion. This does not mean that Eisner's work is invalid in the eyes of academic study. Eisner first introduced the term sequential art. This is highlighted most notably when he discusses the panel border. Quote, its primary function as a frame in which to place objects and actions. The panel border itself can be used as part of the non-verbal language of sequential art. Eisner's work acts as largely a starting point for comics theory, as he primarily discusses theory in relation to his own work. Due to just how simple Eisner's definition is, theorists have taken issue with it as just sequential art, as this could describe anything from comics to frames of animation or film, even art being hung on the walls next to other pieces. In his 1993 book, Understanding Comics, Scott McCloud attempted to build on this by expanding the definition. McCloud came up with 5 different definitions that expanded upon Eisner's original definition. However, each of these new definitions also raised more questions. Many would also be applied to cell animation or film strips. A number also excluded the idea of text as part of a comic or even conflated the two ideas. Ultimately, McCloud settles on just using Eisner's definition of sequential art, leading to some confusion as to why McCloud spent so much time trying to reach his own definition rather than just discussing the failings of Eisner's original definition. Understanding comics has been criticized by many theorists, largely due to its simplicity, though it's worth mentioning the book was released in 1993. Miodrag, in her book Comics and Language, especially criticizes how understanding comics is still considered holy writ, due to McCloud being what is considered the founding father of comics theory, emphasizing that understanding comics is important and certainly is influential, but comics research has made great strides since its release, that we need to move on from a simplistic definition. Aaron Meskin, in his 2009 paper Defining Comics, also discusses the problems that arise from both Eisner's and McCloud's definitions. But Meskin also takes issue with definitions created by others, such as Heyman and Pratt, Kunzel and Carrier. Meskin's conclusion largely centers around the idea that the definitions that others come to are dependent on comics being just one thing, citing particular problems with Kunzel's idea of the story within a comic must be a moral one. Meskin argues that comics need to have the same freedom awarded to books and film to explore any narrative the author desires. Alongside defining comics as a media, theorists have dissected how we discuss the elements of a comic, primarily the idea of panels and placement. Thierry Groenstein, in their 1999 book, The System of Comics, discusses the idea of spatiotopical parameters within comics. The primary features Groenstein introduces are the concepts of the multi-frame, the hyperframe, and the site. Reference will use a fairly simple page from Action Comics 747 from 1998. This page has only been chosen for the purpose of demonstrating spatiotopical parameters. I'm stumbling over my words. With the multi-frame, you are looking at the multiple frames shown in sequence, the space that each of these frames or panels takes up. These can take multiple shapes, but most often form a rectangular, square, or even a circle. But it's important to note that the multi-frame is specifically referencing the space that the panels themselves take up. With a hyperframe, you are looking at the collective space of these panels. This will also take the form of a rectangle or a square. It represents the collective space the materials take up on the page and presents it as a grouped space rather than one single entity rather than multiple. With the site, however, you are considering the positioning of the panels and their relationship to the page itself, the layout of the panels, its relationship to the page's borders, and the space between the panels. As Groenstein states, the positioning of a panel in a page corresponds to a particular moment in the unfolding of a story and also in the process of reading. Neil Cohen, lead researcher at the Visual Language Lab in Tilburg University, takes Groenstein's research and dissects it further, looking at the margin space between panels and how different layouts affect the reader's perspectives. Primarily, Cohen devises a system of definitions for how different panels interact and the path created by the margin space. His work was first formulated in the book The Visual Language of Comics in 2013. The first definition is the pure grid. This appears when the margins for all 4 sides are level. The most common example of this is when there are simply 4 panels set up. Next, you have staggering. This can occur both vertically and horizontally, but is defined by a step created by the margin space around a set of panels. Whole row is just that, a single panel that forms a row on the page, spanning from one side to another. In this case, there are 3 on this page. Blockage occurs when the pathway of the margin is blocked from continuing on its original direction and naturally leads to a 90-degree angle when followed. An insert is where panels appear inside another panel. In this example from Dark Knight's Metal, you have a full-page artwork of Batman speaking, with a set of insert panels shown with the Justice League reacting and responding. Overlap acts similarly to an insert panel, however. The panel only overlaps another panel without being fully inserted. This creates a separation which can be seen where there's white space separating the overall panel from the above panel. Finally, the bleed is defined as empty space surrounding a panel and the edge of the page. This is much larger than the margin and appears around the side. We've looked at the form of a comic, but other avenues of comic research exist. Some have been largely neglected, while others are still developing. These are the studies that I find the most interesting when it comes to looking at time. So what is being overlooked here? Marshall McLuhan, and I swear that is not a picture of him, it was just the best one to match this. He's a celebrated philosopher introducing the idea of media being an extension of man, an idea that is fundamental in studies of interactive media. A classic example would be being an extension of your legs. McLuhan considers just how we experience the world and its effects on us. Being a McLuhanist myself, his research is fundamental when looking at reader participation and comics. So in the 1964 book, Understanding Media, McLuhan discusses printed media. He describes print as a medium of repeatability, as print can be duplicated infinitum, but also a medium of reduction, as it reduces even the spoken language to a visual mode. However, it also compels the reader into participating by completing and interpreting the written word within their minds. McLuhan discusses comics immediately after his chapter on print, heavily signifying that comics could not be discussed without first discussing print. McLuhan considers comics as a medium that fully takes advantage of participation from the reader, calling them a do-it-yourself form of media. He draws attention to the fact that comics require the reader's interaction from the process of time within the medium. As an example, we can use 2 pages from Superman Batman number 5 from 2020. For context, Superman and Batman are fighting against an evil version of Batman from a dark reality, known as the Batman Who Laughs. A Batman who has essentially become the Joker. The Batman Who Laughs has corrupted a number of their friends, including Supergirl and Shazam, as well as bringing a ship from a dark universe into this one. While fighting, Superman crashes into the ship and finds the body of the Justice League from the dark universe, proof of just how cruel the Batman Who Laughs can be. However, when Superman turns around, he sees this. The body of not only his alternate universe self, but his wife Lois and young son John. How long it takes Superman to turn around is dependent by our own abilities to turn the page. How long Superman sits in front of this horrifying memorial is dependent on how long the reader spends in this panel. Scott McCloud heavily references McLuhan's work. This can be most evident from the book's titles. McCloud does heavily lean into the idea of a do-it-yourself form of expression. This can be seen in his implementation of what McCloud refers to as leap of faith transitions. These leap of faith transitions refer to the active role of the reader when filling in the gaps between panels. The idea of closure, where the reader closes the mental gap between the 2 images they are given. This comes in the form of 6 distinct transitions. Moment to moment can simply be described as a slow observation of an event over a short period of time. In this case, we see a series of 4 panels showing Superboy Prime discovering he can fly. The panels give us a very clear idea of how Superboy Prime is moving in each frame. Action to action shows a transition dependent on a single action. In this case, it's the new Rorschach removing his gloves to prove his identity and signify he is indeed a different Rorschach to Marionette. For context, the original Rorschach was a ginger-haired white man named Walter Kovacs, meaning that the removal of his glove to show his skin color is a muff-proof needed for Marionette. With subject-to-subject transitions, the subject the panel is focusing on changes. In this case, you have 3 panels showing the confession room in Sanctum. The three panels show three different subjects, Lagoon Boy, Wally West Flash, and Booster Gold, all using the room at different times. While the location stays the same, the subjects, the characters, changes. Scene-to-scene transitions typically occur between pages, but can also happen on the same page. It represents a transition from one scene to another. McCloud states that this transition takes the most reader involvement. You are transported across significant distances of time and space. However, the two scenes are connected. In this case, the scene transition is triggered by the Batman who laughs talking about his master and the overarching goal. We go from a scene where the Batman who laughs is talking to a scene showing his master. Finally, you have non sequitur transitions. These are transitions that have no obvious connection. In this case, one page depicting the speedsters of the DC universe being chased by the Darkest Knight, while the scene transitions to Superman and the rest of the League reuniting with their friends. This is typically done between two pages. Groenstein discusses the idea of the pregnancy of the panel, that the content of a panel can differ and change the panel's weight within a story, even if two panels are the same size. Their size does not equal the length of time, it's their content that defines it. It's with this that Groenstein makes a very important distinction between comics and film. Three panels do not act the same way as three frames of film. A frame of film typically lasts 1/24th of a second. They have a dedicated length of time attached to them. While a moment can be extended depending on how long a director wishes to hold a single shot, the individual frame length will always be the same, 1/24th of a second. As well, a panel's length is dependent on both its content, the pregnancy of the panel, and the reader's own involvement. Pascal Lefevre's work looks at the construction of space within a panel. His primary argument is that a comic, especially a printed one, can never truly show three-dimensional space. This is most evidently seen with comics such as Batman Digital Justice. Released in 1990, the comic was one of the first to be entirely created using a computer. The graphics were created using early 3D rendering software. However, despite this fact, the images will always be two-dimensional as it's printed on a flat plane. Comics can only ever imply the three-dimensional space. The characters can only ever imply the three-dimensional space the characters live in. This is achieved through elements relating to positioning, coloring, and shading. So in this panel from the infamous The Dark Knight Returns in 1986, you see a fully armored Batman ready to face off against Superman. The sense of space largely comes from the pair's relative positioning to one another, the size of both characters, and the use of lighting. Batman is firmly positioned on the ground underneath a street lamp. Batman appears fully lit with defined details within his design, while Superman appears above, drawn exclusively as a silhouette, denoting that he is far enough away from the light produced to not affect him. However, I'd like to note that Miller did feel the need to give him his red cape still. The surroundings shows a row of buildings on either side, with the vanishing point extending to the horizon. A sense of space is given. We are aware that the pair are in a somewhat narrow street with minimal lighting. We have a sense of roughly how high Superman is based on the lack of light reaching him, but also the relative size of his body. He is close to Batman on the x-axis, but relatively high on the y. Batman's positioning within the image does block off part of the row of buildings, and this would be overlapping of a character with the environment. However, the visual information available provides the reader with enough information to still gain a grasp of the representational three-dimensional space. The choice to present the panel vertically allows the reader to have that sense of scale in regards to Batman and Superman's positioning. Had the panel been presented horizontally, the idea of Superman above Batman wouldn't have been presented as clearly, though the background environment would have been more of a presence. I would like to just take this moment to point something out within the work I've just discussed. Theorists are still trying to find an appropriate definition for the comic book medium. Eisner's introduced sequential art. McCloud failed to expand upon it as he didn't help to distinguish the medium from the likes of film or animation. Kunzel, Heyman, and Pratt all discussed that the concept of a comic must be, particularly in the case of Kunzel, who states that comics should tell a moral story. However, theorists do agree that time is an invaluable asset to comics, and it's something comics can play with in a way that no other medium possibly can. A film will always be a specific length. You can calculate how long it would take you to read a book based on your words per minute speed. But with comics, they can play with time and actively bring the reader into the experience. Therefore, shouldn't the definition for comics highlight this fact? Therefore, while this is just currently an outcome of my research so far and not a central focus, I do propose the definition, a visual representation of time through sequentially juxtaposed iconography. This definition does actually allow for things like words to be introduced into a comic. It allows for other visual images to be used, such as photographic comics, but it still puts emphasis on the reader's involvement with the time. But that is a side thing right now. Despite the work discussed, there are areas relevant to the field that lack extensive analysis or are only considered the subject material from a generic standpoint. So color within comics is primarily based in the form of basic color theory when discussing characters' costumes, or when it comes to recoloring of older titles. Comics recoloring is less common as technology and printing ability has changed. Both of these images are the same panel within Crisis on Infinite Earths. However, the top panel shows the coloring used with the original 1986 printing. Due to the limitation in printing, the original publication was very limited in the palette it could display. This is a major reason why an old nickname for comics was the four-color funnies. According to Paul Levitz, former president of DC Comics, recoloring for older comics followed the principle of wanting to convey information on the page as clearly as possible. A major reason why here, the original printing shows all the characters in the background being the same stock purple, while the recoloring introduces the finer details. In his book, Comics and Senses from 2014, Ian Haig dedicates 2 pages to color within comics. However, he's more focused on how the eye perceives color on the printed page. Haig does acknowledge the importance of both Lefevre's and McCloud's work. However, McCloud's work on color is minuscule within understanding comics, and Lefevre's focus more on landmark structure and spatial positioning. All 3 theorists do touch on the importance of color, but with the exception of Lefevre, who focuses on conveying space, they consider color in a more general sense. I would also like to mention that understanding comics, despite having a section discussing color, is an almost entirely black and white book. Elements such as speed lines have also been briefly touched on when discussing comics, primarily in how-to guides. Despite the conveying motion in a still frame, little is written about the subject on an academic level, along with the exposure time effects, affecting the reader's perception of time as it's happening. A possible research avenue for this is established work on animation and manga, but it should be firmly focused on Anglophone studies. Tripping over words again. So, where does my research come into this? Through looking at available research, I've drawn up a series of research questions that I'm currently working to answer. I expect that these questions will grow far more as I research, but at the moment, it's my goal to answer these specifically. So, how does the use of color affect the reader's perception of time periods? Do specific color effects give different impressions when used to convey time travel? Should character continuity be taken into account? Granted, this question is more based on the intertextuality level, but when you're working with a visual medium of comics that have such a long history, it's still worth taking into account. How does the use of superspeed, speed lines, and exposure effects affect the perception of time within a panel or page? Do overlapping panels affect moment-to-moment perception? Do specific instances of the comic purposely messing with time wildly differ from moment-to-moment progression? As I think these slides have demonstrated, I am very much interested in superhero comics. So a quick history lesson. Superhero comics began with Action Comics #1, released in 1938 as it introduced Superman to the world. Comics did exist before this point, but mostly funny animal comics, westerns, and a few sci-fi stories. The parameters for defining a superhero comic can be seen in the work of Peter Coogan in his 2009 paper, The Definition of a Superhero, creating a series of criteria that defines exactly what a superhero is. Primarily, this comes in the form of mission. This acts as their overarching mission, such as Batman and his drive to eliminate crime, the same crime that left him as an orphan. Powers, though this comes in some form of power over regular characters, whether this be actual powers, such as Static's command over electricity, or power that comes in the form of advanced technology, such as Iron Man. That is also the only Marvel character in these slides. My bias is showing. Next is identity, creating a persona or separate identity than their everyday identity. A big example of this is the massive difference between Clark Kent and Superman. Finally, we have costume, a signifying piece of clothing that identifies them. The relationship between costume and identity is often noted within superhero comics, as Barbara Brownie and Danny Graydon explore in their book, The Superhero Costume, that the relationship between dress and behavior is so commonly understood that people will modify their behavior to suit their clothing. But to look specifically at stories using time and the medium to its full effect, we have to look at a specific kind of superhero comic. Within the realms of DC Comics, there exist a series of stories known as the Crisis Events. The purpose of these stories has always been to alter the DC universe, whether by changing continuity or completely rebooting the canon. However, simply having Crisis in the title does not make a story a crisis event. So stories like Heroes in Crisis and Identity Crisis, despite having Crisis in their title, are not crisis events. How many times did I just say crisis? At the moment, there are 7 Crisis events confirmed. Crisis on Infinite Earths, 0 Hour, Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, Flashpoint, Convergence, and Dark Knight's Metal. These range from 1986 to 2018. DC's official definition for the Crisis events came from both Young Justice #1 and Action Comics #1008, both from 2019, both by Brian Michael Bendis, and proof that he can do something right. During Young Justice, 2 characters discuss the idea of an Earth crisis. They state, "Have you ever heard tell of an Earth crisis? It is what they call it when an unnatural event changes the Earth against its natural evolution." And this really got to me. They say that Earth has survived 7 of these crises. Every time a crisis happens to the Earth, everything the Earth touches, it seems to affect. 7 times this has happened. The list of these events then appears in Action Comics #1008. Within these events, 2 eras of the DC universe can be represented. Post-Crisis, which takes place between 1986 to 2011, and the current New 52/Rebirth era. Given the New 52/Rebirth era is still in effect and is currently adding to the previous events with the currently ongoing Dark Knight's Metal Death Metal, which is most excellent, by the way, my study will be focusing on the post-Crisis era of events, and this includes 4 event titles: Crisis on Infinite Earths, 0 Hour, Infinite Crisis, and Final Crisis. Released within 1985 and 1986, Crisis on Infinite Earths was written by Marv Wolfman with the assistance and art by George Perez. The story's goal was ultimately to make the continuity of DC's comics easier to understand and allow new readers to follow the universe more clearly after its publication. The story of Crisis on Infinite Earth involves an antimatter wave destroying various worlds across the multiverse. The Monitor, the cosmic being who watches over the multiverse, gathers various heroes from across DC's continuity to protect and save as many of the varying worlds as they can, ultimately ending with continuity streamlined and only one Earth remaining. Released in 1994 with writing and art by Dan Jurgens, inked by Jerry Ordway, Zero Hour Crisis in Time acts as an indirect sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths. Within the story, a wave of entropy is moving from the end of time towards the beginning, causing time itself to unravel. Infinite Crisis acts more as a direct sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths. Written in 2006 by Jeff Johns with art primarily provided by Phil Jimenez. We say primarily because during publication, Phil Jimenez had a baby, so someone else had to take over for a bit. Infinite Crisis comes at a very tumultuous time within the DC universe, causing the Justice League and the public to largely distrust one another. This allows the story's villains to attempt to undo the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths and separate the multiverse once again. My final example is Final Crisis, written by Grant Morrison with art primarily handled by J.G. Jones and released in 2009. Final Crisis took a look at the grand cosmic scale of the DC universe and put both it and continuity at risk. Darkseid, a longtime villain of the DC universe, finally takes control of Earth, and now time and space are at risk as heroes try to find a way to save both the Earth and the multiverse. I will state that if anyone is looking to get into comics, the Crisis events are definitely not where you start. Even when cutting it down to just 4 stories, that's a lot of reading. I am technically missing a volume, however, it was brought for me as a birthday gift. I do want to give you all a small look at what fascinates me about all this, and I'd like to use the book that got me to truly think about the perception of time within comics. On the left, you will see the recent release omnibus for Zero Hour, which is the one I will be using in my study as it contains every issue related to the event. On the right, however, is the paperback copy I originally read and what inspired my research. Unlike the omnibus, it only contains 5 issues, collecting just the core story with none of the added detail. Zero Hour is largely overlooked when it comes to not only Crisis events, but also events in general from DC. People consider it a little unnecessary at the time. It was a lot shorter than Crisis on Infinite Earths and had a lot of tie-ins. From my point of view, it's just laying the blueprints for what DC is doing now. Personally, I really enjoy Zero Hour for the outstanding character moments. This is from the second to last page when the team is celebrating beating the bad guy. The Green Arrow, who had to face a lot of harsh truths about the past, silently walks back to his home. The middle panel shows him just stopping and contemplating what to do, before violently breaking his bow in anger. The moment of triumph the team had on the previous page is now undermined by a true sadness of everything they had to face, just to get back. The more I actually look at this moment, especially after starting to dive into the research portion of my degree, the more I notice, especially the use of color and framing, to convey that sense of pacing. However, let's jump back to the end of the second to last chapter to see Parallax, the former hero Green Lantern, jumping into the story and essentially taking the role of the villain. He'd actually been pulling the strings behind the scenes, but that isn't important right now. Parallax begins to enact his plan to restart time and attempts to get the world back to the point where the world made sense to him. He even states, "The universe shouldn't be this way. It needs to be set right." When Parallax begins Zero Hour, hence the title, you have this panel at the bottom of the page. You see Parallax at the bottom center, surrounded by a rainbow of colors. However, the image that takes up most of the space is a circle of blue and white energy. What you will notice, however, is that the white, which is essentially time beginning to stop, now merges with the white margins of the page. While yes, there are no distinct lines drawing panels here anyway, you can still easily draw where there would be by using the information provided by the colors within the page. With the white, however, the panel and the page are becoming one. Time is beginning to stop, and the panels that represent moments in time must also begin to stop. The last page of the second to last issue shows only Parallax as the one who stopped time, being the last thing to fade out, slowly fading away with time itself, leaving us with an entirely white page. Time does not exist here. Panels do not exist. You can spend as long as you wish on this page, but it doesn't matter. Time is non-existent. The final issue begins with two completely white pages emphasizing this non-existence of time. On the third page, it's still white, but in the lower right-hand side, a single thought emerges within the world, a thought coming from Parallax. I used to be the errand boy for the Guardians of the Universe. It was a thankless job. We are now 4 pages into the final issue, and the first thing we see are thoughts, and the beginnings of panels reforming. Time is beginning again. This issue heavily ties into the idea of panel construction, literally with the progression and destruction of time. I still have a lot of research to do, including Groenstein's later works, Miodrag's larger work surrounding comics' network, as well as other theorists who have discussed and furthered the work, like all the theorists have discussed here. After that, theory will be more closely applied to the examples in my case study. My goal in my research is to bring attention to one of the most amazing parts of the comic book medium, the way comics are able to use time and the reader's engagement to create stories that no other medium can tell, that they are worth just as much attention as film or art. By focusing on my research questions and using the DC Crisis events as my examples, my research will contribute to reader participation culture in comics. In conclusion, read comics. I recommend Superman Smashes the Klan. Thank you.